The accident and the monster. The battlefield was silent, but the smell of smoke and blood filled the air. Fires burned in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the ruins of what had once been a grand alien city. Broken buildings stood like ghosts, their walls shattered by war. The ground was littered with debris, metal scraps, broken weapons, and bodies. A low, pained whimper came from beneath a collapsed structure. Princess Ilara lay trapped, her body half buried under heavy rubble. Her sleek, silver-blue armor was cracked, and her right arm hung at an unnatural angle, swollen and bruised. She gritted her teeth, trying to move, but pain shot through her like fire. Her people had abandoned her. The last thing she remembered was her soldiers retreating, their voices echoing in her helmet. They had left her behind, thinking she was dead. She had screamed for them to stop, but no one had listened. Now she was alone. Or so she thought. A shadow moved in the wreckage. Heavy boots crunched over shattered glass. A figure approached, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably human. His armor was scratched and dented, his helmet hanging loosely on his belt. His face was rough, lined with scars, and his dark eyes held an expression of cold determination. Captain Dorian. Ilara's heart pounded. A human soldier. One of the brutes. One of the monsters her people had always feared. She reached for her weapon, but her fingers barely twitched. The pain was too much. Dorian knelt beside her, examining her injuries. His hands were rough, his expression unreadable. "You're lucky," he muttered, brushing dust off her armor. "Could have been worse." Ilara bared her teeth. "Don't touch me, human." Dorian ignored her. He studied her arm, then frowned. "It's broken. Badly." She stiffened. "I know that." Dorian sighed, glancing around. No medkits, no supplies, no way to properly treat her injuries. Only one option left. He was going to have to set the bone, by hand. Ilara realized what he was about to do, and her eyes widened in horror. "No, stay away from me," she shrieked, trying to push him back with her good arm. Dorian didn't move. He just gave her a level stare. "You want to die here? Fine. But if you want to walk again, I need to do this." Ilara's breath came fast. She was trapped, helpless. She hated the idea of this human touching her. But she hated the idea of dying even more. Finally, she clenched her jaw and gave a weak nod. Dorian wasted no time. He grabbed a torn piece of cloth from his belt. "Bite down," he ordered. Ilara hesitated, but took the cloth in her mouth. And then, Turakik. A white-hot explosion of pain shot through her body as Dorian snapped her bone back into place. She screamed, muffled by the cloth. But it wasn't enough to stop the agony. Tears blurred her vision. Her whole body trembled. Dorian held her arm steady, his grip firm but careful. "Breathe," he said. "Pain fades." "You monster," Ilara gasped, her voice hoarse. "You did that on purpose." Dorian smirked slightly. "If I wanted to hurt you, princess, you'd know." Ilara seethed, rage mixing with her pain. She hated him. She hated his calmness, his indifference. How could a human be so cold-blooded? But as much as she hated him, she was still alive. Dorian tied a rough splint around her arm using a torn strip of his own uniform. Then he stood, scanning the area. "We need to move." Ilara blinked through the pain. "What?" "You're injured. You're loud. If we stay here, something worse than me will find us." Ilara shivered. She knew what he meant. The battlefield was filled with things that hunted the wounded. Machines, drones, scavengers. Dorian reached down, offering his hand. "Come on, princess. You're not dead yet." Ilara hesitated. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, but she knew she couldn't walk on her own. Reluctantly, she took his hand. Dorian pulled her up with ease. As they moved into the ruins, Ilara cast one last glance at the place where she had fallen. If the human hadn't found her, she would still be there, waiting to die. She gritted her teeth. She wouldn't thank him. She wouldn't trust him. But for now, she would follow him. The escape and the chase. The ruins stretched in every direction. A shattered skeleton of what was once a great alien city. Towering buildings had collapsed into jagged mountains of steel and stone. Fires flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows against the rubble. Somewhere in the darkness, machines searched for survivors, not to rescue them, but to finish them off. Ilara limped forward, her broken arm bound tightly in a rough splint, her mind still reeling from the pain. Every step sent sharp jolts through her body, but she refused to stop. She wouldn't give this human the satisfaction of seeing her weak. Dorian led the way, his movements silent and precise, like a predator. He moved with an unnatural calmness, his head constantly turning as he scanned for danger. Ilara hated how easily he moved through the battlefield. This was his world. Her world was one of noble halls and politics, not dirt, blood, and war. Yet here she was, dragged along like a helpless child by the very creature her people had called monsters. "Slow down," she snapped, breathless. Dorian didn't stop. "If I slow down, you die." Ilara scowled. She didn't like being ordered around, especially not by a human. Still, she couldn't deny the truth. They were exposed here. The ruins weren't empty. Something was hunting them. And then, a sound. A sharp metallic click. Dorian moved first. He grabbed Ilara and shoved her against the wall, pressing a hand over her mouth. She almost bit him. Almost. But then she heard it too. A mechanical whir, slow and rhythmic. A hunter drone. Ilara's blood ran cold. These machines were designed for one purpose: to track down the injured and eliminate them. They didn't waste energy on healthy soldiers. They went for the weak, the dying, the ones who couldn't fight back. And right now, she was its perfect target. Dorian's grip on her was like iron. His breath was steady, his expression unreadable. He wasn't afraid. Ilara, however, felt her heart pounding against her ribs. The drone hovered just ahead, its red scanning light sweeping over the wreckage. It moved slowly, searching. It knew someone was here. Dorian glanced down at her, then pressed a single finger against his lips. "Stay silent." Ilara clenched her jaw. She wasn't stupid. She knew if the drone detected them, they were dead. Seconds stretched into eternity. The red light drifted closer. Ilara's muscles tensed. If it saw them, she couldn't run. She couldn't even fight. And then, a rock shifted beneath her foot. The noise was soft. Barely anything. But it was enough. The drone's red eye snapped in their direction. It let out a sharp mechanical screech. Dorian moved instantly. He pushed Ilara behind a collapsed wall and drew his weapon. A single shot. The drone exploded. But it was too late. More clicks. More whirs. The other drones had heard. Dorian grabbed Ilara's wrist and pulled her into a sprint. She gasped at the sudden movement, her broken arms screaming in protest. I can't." "You will." They ran. Behind them, the night came alive with machines. Dorian led them through the ruins, weaving between broken structures, leaping over debris with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Ilara struggled to keep up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Every jolt sent agony tearing through her arm, but she refused to stop. She wouldn't let him carry her. She wouldn't be a burden. Dorian yanked her into a tight alley, just as a squad of drones swept past the street behind them. Their glowing red lights painted the walls in eerie patterns. Ilara pressed her back against the cold stone, gasping for air. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Dorian watched the drones pass, then grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and hurled it down the opposite street. The clatter echoed like a gunshot. The drones turned, their red eyes flashing. They took the bait. The machines hovered away, vanishing into the ruins. Silence returned. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ilara whispered, "That was reckless." Dorian arched an eyebrow. "You're welcome, princess." She glared at him. "Don't call me that." Dorian smirked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You're fun when you're angry." Ilara almost punched him. Almost. She looked down at her injured arm, still aching, still weak. She hated this, hated being helpless, and worst of all, hated that she owed this human her life. Dorian pushed off the wall. "We need to keep moving. Those weren't the only drones out here." Ilara narrowed her eyes. "Where are we even going?" Dorian's face darkened. "Somewhere safe." She crossed her arms. "I don't trust you." "Good," he said. "That means you're smart." She scowled. Dorian turned away, leading the way deeper into the ruins. Ilara hesitated for only a second before following. Trust and the battle within. The ruins stretched endlessly around them, towering walls of shattered stone and twisted metal creating a maze of death. The smell of smoke and decay still hung in the air, a reminder that this place had once been full of life, but now it was nothing more than a graveyard. Ilara's breathing was labored, her steps uneven. Her arm throbbed with every movement, a relentless reminder of the pain this human had caused. She hated feeling weak, hated how her body betrayed her with every step. She had been raised in a palace, trained to command, not to survive in the dirt like some wild animal. Yet here she was, following a human through the ruins, trusting him with her life. The thought made her stomach turn. Dorian moved ahead of her, his posture relaxed, but his eyes constantly scanning. Every few steps, he glanced back at her, checking if she was still keeping up. He never said anything about her slowing down, never offered help. But somehow, that made it worse. He expected her to keep going, and she refused to prove him right by falling behind. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached an old abandoned building, half buried under rubble. The entrance was nothing more than a gaping hole in the side, jagged metal, and cracked concrete framing it like the teeth of a beast. Dorian ducked inside first, motioning for Ilara to follow. She hesitated. "What now?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his head. Ilara crossed her arms, her injured one trembling from the motion. "What if it's a trap?" Dorian gave her a deadpan look. "A trap? By who?" "The dust." She scowled. "Humans are deceptive." That made him grin. "Oh, I forgot. Your people think we're monsters, right?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Tell me, princess, do I look like a monster to you?" Ilara met his gaze, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't understand. "Yes," she said coldly. Dorian chuckled and turned away, stepping further into the ruined building. "Fine. Stay out here then. The drones will be happy to find you." Ilara clenched her jaw. He was infuriating. Still, she followed him inside. The shelter and the scar. The inside of the building was dark, cold, and eerily silent. The walls were cracked, plants growing through the broken stone. Old furniture was scattered across the floor, covered in layers of dust. Dorian dumped his pack on the ground and stretched his arms. "We'll rest here for a while." Ilara glared at him. "We should keep moving." He gave her an unimpressed look. "You're half dead, and I'm not carrying you. Sit." She wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her. Her legs trembled, her vision blurred for a moment. The exhaustion was setting in, creeping into her muscles, weighing her down. She hated it. Still, she reluctantly sat against the wall, letting out a quiet breath. Dorian sat across from her, pulling out a small metal flask. He took a sip before tossing it toward her. She flinched. "What's this?" "Water." She eyed him suspiciously. "You expect me to drink something from a human?" Dorian groaned and took another sip to prove it wasn't poisoned. "Just drink it, princess." She wanted to refuse. She really did. But her throat was dry, and she was too tired to argue. Hesitantly, she took the flask and drank. For a moment, there was silence. Then, she noticed something. Dorian was wounded. There was a deep gash along his side, hidden beneath his torn uniform. Blood had dried around the wound, but it was still open, still bleeding. She stared at it. He hadn't even flinched. "You're hurt," she said before she could stop herself. Dorian glanced down, unconcerned. "Not the first time." Ilara frowned. "You should have told me." He raised an eyebrow. "Would you have helped me?" She hesitated. Dorian smirked. "That's what I thought." She didn't know why it bothered her. He was a soldier, a killer, yet here he was, acting like pain was nothing, like he was used to suffering. The thought unsettled her. "You humans, you don't feel pain like we do you?" she asked. Dorian huffed. "We feel it. We just don't complain about it." Ilara scowled. "I wasn't complaining." He laughed. "Oh no, you only screamed, you monster, when I fixed your arm." Her face burned. "That's because you did it like a brute." Dorian shook his head, still amused. "You'd rather I left you with a broken bone." She glared at him. "I'd rather you not act like a barbarian." Dorian leaned back, watching her. "You ever see a battlefield before today?" She stiffened. "That's none of your concern." "That's a no." She exhaled sharply. "I was trained for battle." Dorian gave her a slow look. "Yeah. How's that training working out for you?" Ilara hated how much she wanted to throw something at him. Still, she didn't have an answer. Dorian shifted slightly, adjusting his wound. She saw it again, the raw cut, the dried blood. Against her better judgment, she moved closer. "What are you doing?" he asked. She pulled out a small vial from her armor. "Your wound. It's filthy. You're going to get an infection." Dorian raised an eyebrow, but didn't stop her as she carefully poured a few drops of the liquid onto his wound. He hissed, "That burns." Ilara smirked. "Oh, I'm sorry. Does it hurt?" Dorian chuckled. "You're enjoying this." "A little, yes." She wrapped a cloth around his side, tying it tightly. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep him from bleeding out. When she finished, Dorian looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Thanks," he muttered. Ilara looked away. "Don't misunderstand. If you die, I die. That's all." Dorian grinned. "Sure, princess." Ilara scowled, but didn't reply. For the first time since meeting this human, she didn't completely hate him. The horror in the dark. The night was thick with silence, but Ilara felt something was wrong. She lay on the cold floor of the ruined building, staring at the cracked ceiling above. She should have felt safe. For now, at least. They were hidden. The drones had moved on, and Dorian, despite his many, many flaws, had proven capable of handling himself in battle. But something felt off. There was a presence in the air, a stillness too heavy, too unnatural. She turned her head slightly, glancing at Dorian. He was leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, resting, but not sleeping. His eyes remained half open, always scanning, always alert, like he knew something was coming. Ilara sat up slowly, wincing as pain flared through her broken arm. "You feel it, don't you?" Dorian said quietly. Ilara hesitated. "Feel what?" Dorian tilted his head slightly, listening. And then she heard it. A soft sound. Not mechanical. Not the drones. Something else. A faint, wet dragging noise, like something moving across the ground. Slow, steady, patient. Ilara froze. Her heart pounded as she slowly turned toward the entrance of their shelter. The sound grew closer. Dorian was already moving. He lifted his rifle, eyes dark with understanding. "We need to move. Now." Ilara swallowed hard. "What is it?" Dorian didn't answer. That scared her more than anything. Then, a whisper. Low, hissing. Almost curious. Her blood turned to ice. Dorian grabbed her wrist and pulled her up. "Run." Ilara didn't argue. They moved fast, weaving through the wreckage of the building. Every step sent a fresh wave of pain through her body, but fear drowned it out. Behind them, the whispering grew louder. Not a voice, not words. Something else. Something inhuman. Ilara's lungs burned as they darted into a narrow hallway, the walls covered in thick vines and patches of glowing mold. The scent of decay filled the air. Dorian moved ahead, scanning the path. We can't go back the way we came. Then where do we go? Ilara demanded. Dorian glanced to the side, spotting an old maintenance hatch along the wall. Rusted, but not completely sealed. This way. He moved toward it, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. Behind them, the sound changed. No longer slow. Now rapid. Skittering. Claws on metal. Many claws. Ilara turned, pulse hammering. And for the first time, she saw it. A shape moving through the dark. Long, thin limbs, bent at unnatural angles. Glowing eyes. Not 2, but 6. It crawled, spider-like, along the ceiling, moving between the broken beams of the building. Its skin was dark, shifting in the shadows, making it almost impossible to track. Almost. Ilara's breath caught. Dorian. Yeah, I see it. His voice was calm, but his grip on his weapon tightened. The thing tilted its head, watching them. Then, it lunged. Ilara barely had time to react before Dorian shoved her aside. Gunfire erupted, lighting up the dark. The bullets hit flesh, but instead of a scream, there was only a low guttural clicking sound. The creature twisted midair, its movements unnatural, wrong. It hit the ground and darted toward them, its many legs moving too fast for comfort. Dorian fired again. The thing dodged. It was playing with them. Ilara's breath came fast and sharp. Her people had never mentioned anything like this. What is that? She gasped. Dorian was already pulling her toward the hatch. Something worse than us. He slammed his boot against the rusted metal. The door broke loose, groaning as it swung open. Go, he ordered. Ilara didn't hesitate. She slid through the narrow opening, dropping into the dark tunnel below. Dorian followed right after, just as the creature lunged again. It barely missed him. Its claws scraped against the metal frame, letting out an ear-splitting shriek. Dorian slammed the hatch shut, locking it in place. Silence. Heavy breathing. The distant sound of claws scraping against the other side. Then nothing. Ilara sat on the cold ground, trying to catch her breath. She could still feel the presence of that thing, like its many eyes had burned into her soul. Dorian let out a slow exhale, resting his forehead against the wall. That was close. Ilara looked at him, still shaken. You knew it was out there. Dorian didn't answer. She narrowed her eyes. How did you know? Dorian sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Because I've seen them before. Ilara stiffened. You've fought those things before. Dorian nodded slowly. Yeah. He met her gaze. And trust me, that wasn't the last one. Ilara's stomach dropped. Her people had always spoken of humans as the worst creatures in the galaxy. Violent, dangerous, unpredictable. But as she sat in that dark tunnel, her heart still racing, she realized something terrifying. There were things out there worse than humans. And they were hunting them. The betrayal and the real enemy. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, carved from rough stone and reinforced with rusted metal beams. The air was damp, thick with the scent of old decay, and the only sound was the distant dripping of water somewhere deep within the labyrinth. Ilara pressed her back against the cold wall, her breath still uneven. The encounter with that thing had left her shaken. That creature, the one with 6 glowing eyes and twisted limbs, had moved like no being she had ever seen. And Dorian had known about it. She turned her head toward him, eyes narrowing. He was already on his feet, checking his weapon, his face unreadable. You lied to me, she said, voice sharp. Dorian glanced at her, but didn't react. You'll have to be more specific, Princess. Ilara gritted her teeth. You knew about those creatures. Dorian sighed, adjusting the strap on his rifle. Yeah. Her fingers curled into fists. Why didn't you tell me? He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Would it have changed anything? Ilara opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. Would it have? Would no one have made a difference, or would she have panicked sooner, hesitated more, slowed them down? Still, she hated that he had kept it from her. This human was too good at keeping secrets. She exhaled sharply and pushed herself up. Where are we? Dorian glanced around the tunnel, scanning the walls. Strange markings were etched into the stone, old and barely visible beneath the dirt. Some were symbols she recognized, ancient battle codes used during wartime. We're in an old underground transport system, Dorian said, running a hand along one of the symbols. Pre-war tunnels. They were used for evacuations. Some might still be active. Ilara frowned. How do you know that? Dorian smirked. I read. She rolled her eyes. Still, her mind raced. If these tunnels were from before the war, that meant they could lead to safety. Or to something much worse. She adjusted her splinted arm, swallowing the ache. We should move. Dorian nodded. Agreed. But before they could take another step, a sound echoed from the darkness. A faint beeping. Ilara froze. She knew that sound. Dorian tensed beside her. That's a locator beacon. Ilara's pulse quickened. Her people had found her. The arrival of the fleet. The beeping grew louder, rhythmic and precise. Then, a soft blue light flickered down the tunnel. Voices followed. Alien voices. Ilara's chest tightened. Her people had come. She turned toward Dorian, who had already stepped back into the shadows, his hand on his weapon. Ilara swallowed. I have to go to them. Dorian didn't stop her. He just watched, his expression unreadable. She moved forward, her heart racing. She should have felt relief. But instead she felt uneasy. 3 figures emerged from the tunnel ahead, their silver-blue armor gleaming under the pale light of their locator beacons, soldiers from the Royal Guard. Ilara recognized their insignia. Commander Wails stepped forward first, his dark, narrow eyes locking onto her. His expression didn't soften. Ilara. His voice was calm, but cold. Ilara straightened. You found me. Wails nodded. We received the distress signal. We assumed you were dead. Something in his voice sent a chill through her. She swallowed, glancing back toward Dorian. He stood just out of sight, watching, waiting. Wails followed her gaze. His expression darkened. There's a human with you, he said flatly. Ilara hesitated. Dorian had saved her life. But her people hated humans. They had always seen them as dangerous, unpredictable. Monsters. She took a slow breath. He helped me. Wails didn't react. Where is he now? Ilara hesitated again. Before she could finish, Wails lifted his wrist and pressed a button on his communicator. A bright red pulse shot through the air. Ilara's stomach dropped. An execution signal. Her people weren't here to rescue her. They were here to eliminate all witnesses. Her breath caught. Wait. A shot rang out. Ilara barely had time to react before Dorian moved. He grabbed her, yanking her behind a fallen pillar as plasma fire exploded around them. Ilara gasped, her heart hammering. They're shooting at us. Dorian's voice was calm, but sharp. No, they're shooting at me. She turned, peeking over the edge of the pillar. Her people were advancing, weapons raised, moving in perfect formation. They weren't just soldiers. They were an execution squad. Ilara's blood ran cold. Wails' voice echoed through the tunnel. Eliminate the human. Retrieve the princess. Ilara's stomach twisted. Her people weren't even asking questions. Dorian pressed his back against the stone, loading another round into his weapon. I'm guessing negotiations are off the table. Ilara clenched her fists. They think you're a threat. Dorian smirked. I'm starting to think they're the threat. She turned back to Wails. Wait, he saved me. Wails didn't even blink. That doesn't matter. Ilara's breath hitched. They weren't here to save her. They were here to erase her mistake. Dorian sighed. Yeah, I saw this coming. Ilara's hands trembled. I can stop them. Dorian gave her a look. Are you sure about that? She wanted to be sure. But the way Wails looked at her, the way the soldiers didn't hesitate to open fire, it sent a deep, sickening realization through her. She was nothing but a liability now. And Dorian was a loose end. The soldiers moved in. No hesitation. Dorian took a slow breath. Then, in one smooth motion, he pulled a grenade from his belt and tossed it forward. Ilara's eyes widened. What are you? Boom! The tunnel erupted in dust and fire. Everything went dark. The final stand and sacrifice. The world was a blur of smoke and fire. Ilara stumbled through the rubble, her heart racing, ears ringing from the explosion. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each step sending pain through her body. She barely noticed the blood on her hand or the tear in her uniform. Her focus was entirely on the devastation around her. The human had vanished. Dorian had pulled her back to safety after the grenade blast, but the explosion had separated them. The soldiers had retreated, but the fight was far from over. Ilara's legs shook as she moved through the smoky debris, searching the wreckage for any sign of Dorian. Nothing. The chaos of the explosion still echoed in her ears, but the real silence came when the smoke finally cleared. The tunnel was a war zone, metal scraps, broken concrete, and bodies scattered everywhere. The human soldiers were gone, but her people remained, their weapons aimed and ready. They didn't care about the truth. Wails was in the lead, his dark eyes scanning the wreckage with cold precision. He didn't care about the pain she was in. He didn't care that she was broken, or that the human had saved her. Ilara, Wails called, his voice stern and distant. He hadn't changed. Cold. Calculating. Ilara stood taller, despite the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The fight wasn't over yet. Do not speak to me, she spat. Wails didn't flinch. I don't need your cooperation. His eyes flickered toward her injured arm, the swollen bruise on her skin still fresh from the bone setting. But we will take you back to the capital, whether you want to come or not. Her heart pounded. The thought of returning to the royal palace made her stomach turn. The place where her people had abandoned her, where they viewed her as nothing but a tool. She felt more at home here, in the chaos, with the man they called a monster. But Dorian wasn't here now. Had he died in the blast? Your people would kill him, she said softly, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. You would throw away someone who saved me. Wailis's expression hardened, but he didn't answer. His silence was worse than any words he could have said. Ilara wasn't going back with them. Her decision was final. We'll see about that, she said, eyes flashing with anger. The stand. The air was thick with tension. Ilara stood tall, her hands at her sides, even though the world around her was crumbling. She didn't look at the soldiers directly. Her gaze stayed focused on the path ahead, the flickering lights of the tunnel stretching into the darkness. She had made a choice, and Dorian had made a sacrifice for her. Ilara wasn't going to let that sacrifice be in vain. Without warning, she bolted. Her feet carried her forward with a speed she didn't know she had, her heart pounding in her chest. She heard the shouts from behind, but she didn't stop. Her arm throbbed in agony, but the rush of adrenaline pushed her forward. She wasn't going back to her people. She wasn't going back to a life that had betrayed her. She was going to find Dorian. The crackling of blaster fire behind her urged her forward, but it wasn't the soldiers she feared. It was the things lurking in the shadows. The creatures. The ones that had hunted her and Dorian. The ones she could no longer ignore. As she ran, the feeling of being watched pressed in on her. Her footsteps echoed through the narrow passages, every sound magnified by the eerie quiet. She rounded a corner, and then a figure. Dorian. He was standing at the far end of the tunnel, his back to her, barely visible in the dim light. His silhouette was sharp, angular, and somehow different. His clothes were torn, his armor battered, but he was alive. Alive. "Ilara," he said quietly, not turning. Her breath caught in her throat. She rushed to him. "Dorian, I fought you." He held up a hand, turning slowly to face her. His face was grimmer than before, his eyes haunted, but his posture was still strong. "You're not safe here," he said flatly. Ilara didn't care. She ran straight into his arms, relieved, grateful beyond measure. For a moment, everything was still. Then she pulled away. "We need to leave now." Dorian's eyes softened for just a second, but the moment was gone. His expression hardened again. "It's not that simple." He turned and moved toward a set of ancient doors, his movements fluid, practiced. "What do you mean?" Ilara followed him closely. "We got a bigger problem than just your people. Those creatures." He shook his head. "They're coming for both of us." Ilara's breath faltered. "Then we need to fight them." Dorian gave her a small, humorless smile. "I was hoping you'd say that." The moment he spoke, a low growl echoed from the darkness. The sound they'd feared. The creatures were closing in. Ilara stepped beside him, reaching for her weapon. "What's the plan?" Dorian met her eyes, his gaze cold but filled with respect. "We stand and fight. We make them pay for every step they've taken toward us." The final stand. The tunnel was bathed in darkness, the only light coming from their weapons as they stood together, shoulder to shoulder. The creatures' growls grew louder. There was no running, no escaping. They were trapped. Dorian raised his rifle, and Ilara did the same. The creatures were close now, their glowing eyes flashing in the darkness. They moved in a pack, an endless swarm of twisted bodies, legs scraping against stone as they crawled toward their prey. "We're not getting out of here without a fight," Dorian said quietly. "I don't want to get out of here without one," Ilara replied, voice filled with determination. The creatures lunged, and the battle began. Gunfire echoed through the tunnel as Dorian and Ilara fought back to back, their weapons blazing, but the creatures were relentless. They came in waves, their claws slicing through the air. Dorian's rifle jammed. He dropped it without hesitation and drew his knife. "They're too fast," he muttered. Ilara fired again, picking off the ones closest to her. Her arm throbbed, but she kept moving. "Then we keep moving faster." They fought with everything they had. Their bodies were exhausted, but their wills were unyielding. But the creatures were endless. Dorian threw Ilara behind him, taking the brunt of a vicious attack as a creature lunged at him. He slashed at its throat, but more were coming. Too many. "Go," Dorian shouted. "Get out of here. I'll hold them off." Ilara hesitated, staring at him. "No, we fight together. I'm not going to let you die because of me." Dorian's voice was strained. "Go, Ilara. You'll make it out. You have to." Tears stung her eyes, but there was no time. She knew what he meant. He was going to stay and fight, give her the chance to escape. And she wouldn't leave him behind. "I'm not leaving you." The words were barely out of her mouth when Dorian shoved her away, his knife raised as the creatures swarmed him. "Go," he screamed one last time. With a broken heart, Ilara ran, but she could hear him fighting behind her, his defiance echoing through the tunnel. The monster who became a hero. The world around Ilara was a blur as she ran through the tunnels, the pounding of her heart drowning out everything else. Dorian's sacrifice had bought her the chance to escape. His shout echoed in her ears as she sprinted down the narrow corridor, her breath ragged, her injured arm hanging limply by her side. The sounds of the battle, the creatures and Dorian's final stand, faded as she pushed herself harder, further into the unknown. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Not yet. Her mind raced. Dorian had stayed behind, facing the creatures head-on to give her a chance at life. But was he dead? She knew she'd never be able to forgive herself if he was, but she also knew that he had made a choice. He had sacrificed himself for her, for the chance that she could escape the madness and live to tell their story. But what story would that be? Her people would never believe what had happened, how a human had fought alongside her, had saved her life at every turn. They would never see him as anything other than a monster, not even now, when he had shown them all the meaning of true bravery. Ilara stopped for a moment, leaning against the cold, damp wall. She could feel the weight of it all, her broken arm, the weight of the lives that had been lost, and the reality of the situation. Her people weren't just hunting her down anymore. They would stop at nothing to ensure she would be silenced. A traitor to her own race, someone who had allied with the enemy. But Dorian had made her see something she hadn't been able to understand before. Humans weren't monsters. They were survivors, fighters, and sometimes they were heroes. Her mind flashed back to the moment when Dorian had risked everything for her, how he had moved so quickly, without hesitation, to save her from certain death. She couldn't let that be in vain. She had to make it out. She had to keep going. For him. For everything he had done. The path ahead. Her legs ached, and the exhaustion threatened to overtake her, but Ilara pushed forward. She couldn't afford to stop. She couldn't afford to rest. Behind her, the creatures were still out there. Ahead of her, the tunnel stretched on into darkness, but she kept moving, feeling the weight of the path behind her, and knowing that she was running away from everything that had defined her life up to this point. The past was behind her, and the future was a mystery. She had no idea where she was heading, but she knew that she couldn't go back. Not to her people, not to the place that had abandoned her when she needed them most. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a massive underground cavern. The air was different here, cool, fresh, filled with the scent of something old and forgotten. The cavern was vast, its edges barely visible in the dim light. Cracked stone columns rose up from the ground like ancient sentinels, and the floor was covered in layers of dirt and decay. A strange sense of calm washed over Ilara as she entered the cavern. She moved cautiously, her senses alert, but her exhaustion made everything feel distant. She had no idea what lay ahead, but the uncertainty was almost peaceful. That's when she heard it, a sound from behind her, echoing off the cavern walls. Footsteps. Her heart skipped a beat. No, it couldn't be. She spun around, half expecting the creatures to be on her heels. But instead, she saw something else. A shadow. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. But no, it was real. The silhouette of a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and walking with a familiar, confident stride. Dorian. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. He had been left behind, sacrificed to give her a chance at life. The last time she had seen him, he had been fighting off the creatures, trying to hold them back long enough for her to escape. But here he was, alive. She stumbled forward, still unable to believe her eyes. Dorian. Her voice was barely a whisper. The figure turned toward her, his expression unreadable but calm. His armor was still battered, his face smeared with dirt and blood, but his eyes, those eyes, were unmistakable. Ilara, he said, his voice low but full of quiet strength. I'm not going to let you face this alone. She couldn't speak. The emotions overwhelmed her, relief, joy, but also something deeper, something she hadn't expected. Dorian, she managed to say. How did you? He held up a hand, his voice soft but firm. I told you, I wasn't going to let you die out here. I made sure they couldn't follow. Now we have to finish what we started. Ilara felt a rush of emotion, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Hope, a feeling that had been so foreign to her, buried deep beneath the weight of war and loss. But now it was here, with him. The human who had been her savior, the monster who had shown the galaxy what true courage really looked like. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice cracked. Dorian gave her a brief, tight smile. "We're not done yet. There's still a lot to fix." She nodded, understanding what he meant. The war, the creatures, her people, they all still lay ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Ilara felt like she had something to fight for. Something worth fighting for. A new beginning. Together, they moved through the cavern, the path uncertain but no longer full of despair. Ilara had crossed a line, and so had Dorian. They had both learned the hardest lesson. Sometimes the ones who are called monsters are the ones who are most human. They would face whatever came next, but this time they would do it together. They were no longer enemies. They were survivors. And perhaps they were something more. Heroes in their own right. The end was far from certain, but with every step they took into the unknown, Ilara realized something vital. The journey was far from over, and maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to rewrite their own fate.